Amber, I think I've got one teacher that's on the way. I just gave her a link, not one that had signaled on the calendar event, but she'll probably be showing up in a sec. But don't let
Okay,
that stop you from just going.
no problem. Yeah, I don't know why you don't want to, take advantage of school busing. Seems to make the most sense.
Well, and part of being in our world, when we listen to everything, we have to go, okay, well, A, will this even work in our world, like busing? And
Yep.
B, how do we translate that over? And like, I don't know, Amber, if they just did like a RTI at work training at the center on the Grove that I went to. And so much of the PLC stuff is centered on timing, like when you're mapping out your units. That's not really a factor in our world because students will do it when they do it. And one of the central problems in the online classroom is the students are never in one place at the same time. I mean, like if you
Yeah.
go to do a piece of instruction on the Unit 3 essay and there are 30 kids, when you deliver that, if you're, 10 of those students are long past the Unit 3 essay. 10 of those students haven't started your course yet, and 10 are on the Unit 3. So how do you adjust to that? We have to do that with everything, and then we have to say, okay, how does that look in our world? And again, that's why the first time we did this, I was so thankful to you because I we met and I thought this is perfect for like what I told you about what we need, and what you did was perfect.
Oh, good. Yeah, and that we're gonna dive in, but also is why like the publicly released items are usually better for your kind of situations because you don't have to worry about monitoring students or if they get out to families or things like that. So um, we'll show what that looks like in science because it is a little bit different too. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started because it sounds like the majority of us are here. Thank you for giving me some of your time on a Friday in May. I know May is a crazy time of year. Um, and so I appreciate you all showing up here and being ready to talk ISAT science. So, a little bit about me, because I know when I go to professional developments, always appreciate getting to know the human behind the presenter. So, my name is Amber Van Voren. I am the interim and formative assessment coordinator. Prior to starting with the State Department a couple years ago, I began my career as a classroom teacher in the elementary world. Then I worked as a regional math specialist through Boise State, focusing mainly on supporting elementary and then a few middle schools as well. And then most recently was a math instructional coach for the Valley View School District. So done a few different things, but throughout all of those, really just appreciated the importance that assessment and evidence of student thinking really plays into informing instruction. A little bit about my personal life. I like to crochet and play a lot of board games and then spend time with my cat, Persimmon, who she is very sweet and also very feisty. So she lives up to her orange cat status, um, and is one of those rare ones that she is a female instead of a male. So since you're all scientists, you may not know that the orange colored, like the gene that carries that, is like 70% of the cats that are orange are like male. And so I have one of the rare genetic orange cat females, which is fun. And just a few things that I'm passionate about as far as in the education world is really building capacity in others. So when I was in the classroom, that was with, my elementary kiddos. And then as I've moved more to working with teachers and administrators, still helping them grow within their profession so that they can be the best and serve students well. And then I truly believe in holding high expectations for every learner, giving them access and supports to be able to um, achieve those, but never really lowering the bar because we know that wherever we set that bar, kids will rise to it. So if we can make sure that it's set high for every kiddo or student, then we can provide the supports and give them the confidence to reach it. Now I would like to know just a little bit about you all. I know the majority of you are science teachers. I think we had maybe a few that were special education. But please just drop your name and then the grade level or grade levels that you support or teach, and then any specific courses that you support as well. Give you a few minutes to do that. Great. Thank you to those who dropped a little bit about themselves in the chat. If you're still doing that, you're still welcome to put it in there. I see that we have a few that are focused on social studies. The majority of what we'll talk about today is science, since that's the focus. However, when we get to the end and do some of the resource exploration, I will drop the handout for the that I gave to the ELA and math teachers, because I know a lot of those things can go cross content. So for those of you who don't solely focus on science, I'll drop that later on in our conversation today. So, so here's kind of a layout of what we'll be discussing today. So first, starting with what is the ISAT measuring? And again, the main focus will be on science. What are some things that are considered when creating science items? What resources are available to help both understand what is being measured, but also support students access the test content, and then by doing so, access the standards. And then thinking through how can the available resources be used intentionally to support your students. So take a few moments, and I just want you to quickly, it says brief write, so you can jot it down, you can do it mentally, whichever works best for you. But I want you to choose one of these sentence starters and finish it. So the purpose of assessment is to, or I can use assessment to. If you're feeling brave and want to drop it in the chat, you're welcome to do so, or you can just do it independently and kind of keep it to yourself. Either way. All right. Hopefully you had some time to think through that. I realized I forgot to introduce my colleague. Jamen, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Sorry that I skipped over you this morning.
Hi, good morning. Oh, no, that was fine. I'm Jim Ansell. I am a program specialist with assessment and accountability, and I'm here to also learn from Amber. So it's great meeting you all. Thank you.
Yeah, Jermaine joined our team in um, October, which does not feel like that long ago, but has been a while at this point. And has been a super big help in just supporting our team and supporting those giving the ISAT. So she's here to learn, but also to support me and help me kind of monitor everything. All right. So whenever we talk about assessment, um, we want to make sure that we have kind of the broader definition of what is meant by assessment, as well as understanding that sometimes it is also used interchangeably with the idea of like tests or more formal events. However, the broader idea of assessment is really gathering information and evidence about student thinking. So, what do they know and what are they able to do? And we can do that through specific tools and tests, which we will also sometimes talk about or use the word as assessments. But we want to make sure that even those more formal tools are fitting within that broader scope of it's really about trying to best understand what students are thinking and how they're making sense of things. In today's conversation, we're going to focus more on that definition of like a testing event since we're discussing the ISAT. Um, but more broadly, assessments generally serve kind of these two interconnected purposes and fall usually somewhere along a continuum between having instructional purposes or more evaluative purposes. So, instructional would be things that I can know and understand about the specific students in front of me to make direct changes to their instructional path, my instruction for the class as a whole, whatever that might look like. And evaluative doesn't just mean like it could mean evaluating student performance, so like reporting, grading, those sorts of things, but it can also mean evaluating programs or systems that support students. So are the lessons that I'm teaching or the curriculum that we are using, is that having the intended purpose, right? So it's really just trying to say, how are we? Let's make maybe a judgment and some broader decisions moving forward. So this visual shows some of the most common types of assessment and approximately where they would fall along that continuum. So you'll notice that many more formal types of assessments can serve two of these purposes, but are generally designed to best serve one. So the ISAT is designed more for that evaluative space. How can we use it to evaluate programs, see trends over time? And while there are a few places that we can use, like if we're talking about the end of year ISAT, like the target reports we could use instructionally, it's not intended to be like, hey, I'm going to take these results and adapt the lesson that I'm teaching the next day or the content that I have for the rest of the school year. It's really looking at that broader system view. With any data collection, and especially when it comes to the assessment world, we really want to make sure that purpose is at the forefront. If we aren't clear on why we're giving it or how we plan to use that data, then it's probably not worth the time to actually give it. So making sure that we have the right tool based on whatever the purpose we are trying to achieve. I always use the analogy of like other types of measurement tools, right? Because that's what assessments are designed to do, is to measure something. So if I'm trying to measure how much water is in a bowl, I could use a ruler and figure out the volume, but that probably is not the most efficient tool. It'd be easier to use, you know, a graduated cylinder or a measuring cup that will actually just tell me the volume. So making sure what's the purpose and do I have the right tool for that purpose. This is not an exhaustive list, and I'm not going to read it all for you, but these are just some of the most common purposes that we use when we give those more like formal assessment tools, or even classroom assessment tools. As I mentioned earlier, the summative ISAT that we give every spring is really that top bullet. It is purposely designed to help evaluate systems, programs, and then curriculum and resources. We can do a little bit of measuring student growth, not as much in science since it's only given in like grade bands as opposed to every grade level. But those more instructional based bullets at the bottom is not where the summative ISAT is going to live. And then just because it's always worth mentioning, why we give standardized assessments is so that people at every level of the instructional system or the educational system can make informed decisions based on valid data. So when we say valid, what that means is the inferences we can make about what students know and can do or what the test is designed to measure are as strong and accurate as possible. So it's not the test itself that's valid, it's the data and the inferences that we make from that data. And then when we have valid results, that's what allows us to make those informed decisions about the effectiveness of programs and systems, how our curriculum and instruction might be impacting student performance. And it can also help us with the allocation of support and resources, which is a lot of what it looks like for the State Department, is seeing, hey, where are there maybe, schools or pockets that could use some sort of additional support, additional resources to help students be successful. All right, so let's dive in a little bit more to what the Science ISAT specifically is measuring. So if you're on camera, you're welcome to actually do this with your hand if you'd like. You can also just add a number in the chat, whatever works best for you. But just a quick fist to 5, so you're using some formative assessment strategies. Fist being, I have no understanding, 5 meaning, Amber, I could probably teach this. How well do you feel you currently understand domains, disciplinary core ideas, clusters versus standalone items on a Science ISAT? Hey, I see a mix of 1s and 3s. So those who are like, just a little bit, and those who are like, okay, I think I have, pretty average understanding. So I'll go ahead and take, because I see a decent amount of 1s, I'll go ahead and take some time really in this section. And then the resources that we explore later on will give you even more insight. But as we kind of talk about the structure of the test itself, I'll make sure that I don't just rush through it because it seems like we have a decent number of you who could benefit from that. So when we think about each of our different content areas, each of those content areas is broken into either claims, or in science we call them domains, which are basically kind of umbrella terms that a grouping of various standards could fall under. So in science, it's going to be around those science domains. So earth and space science, life science, physical sciences, and then the science and engineering practices. So we also specifically report out on those SEPs. I've included the ELA and math breakdown here. In ELA and math, we refer to those as claims, but you'll still see that they're those broad umbrella categories of like reading, writing. In math, we have the idea of concepts and procedures, but then problem solving, communicating, reasoning. So claims or domains are really those big umbrella kind of like buckets that our standards fall into. Then each of those domains, so again, just focusing on science, is broken down into what are called disciplinary core ideas, which are groupings of similar standards that share a big idea. So no matter which standards we're looking at, we know that they're meant to be interconnected, right? So we have individual standards that are broken down, but they're usually clustered or grouped together because we know that teaching in isolation, one, is not how our brain learns. We need to make as many connections as possible, but it's also not how the world works. So all of these skills kind of connect together. So our test assesses it at that level. The other reason it does not test individual standards is to get that valid and reliable data. We would have to have so many items for an individual standard that the test would be very, very long. And it's already a pretty lengthy test. So being able to report out kind of these bigger groupings allows us to get that bigger kind of systemic picture, a quick snapshot for that point in time, but without having to be a very long, extensive test, more so than it is. So I have an example here from 5th grade, which I know that you all are not in the elementary space, but just to show how standards across a grade band will make up each of those disciplinary core ideas. So this example is from 5th grade science, and you'll see that both 3rd grade, 4th grade, and 5th grade standards are being addressed within that core idea of Earth's systems. So in middle school, they're already, kind of grouped for you, and then just around those domains of life, earth, or physical sciences. But just know they will see pieces of the entire middle school standards, but looking kind of at those DCIs. So something to keep in mind, whether you do like an integrated science approach or more kind of a course approach, just being mindful that students will see a variety across the standards. Just that broader look of how the test overall is developed. So we have those 4 domains, one of which is the science and engineering practices, those disciplinary core ideas within each domain, and then those standards are what make up the DCI. So we won't report out at the standards level, but they are still reflected and assessed on our test. One thing we always like to communicate is the test is developed based on our Idaho standards, not the other way around. So all item development is based on here is what our Idaho standards say, what is the alignment between this item, and how does it match? So the assessment is informed by the standards. The standards are not informed by the assessment, if that makes sense. Okay. So to really see kind of how things are broken down across those different domains, we have what are called the ISAT blueprints. For all content areas, I think this is one of the resources that I find most helpful, but it's definitely lacks kind of awareness that it's out there. But it will outline what standards are assessed within each of those domains, the number of items in each of the domains that students will see on their test, and how many of those items are standalone versus a cluster. If you're like, I don't know what standalone or cluster means, I'm going to give you an example. So a cluster item means that on the left side, there's some sort of stimuli or phenomenon. So the example here is about like magnetism. So it's a scenario, a phenomenon, and then on the right side, they'll see multiple parts that all deal with that same phenomenon. So it's a cluster of items related to a phenomenon. So in like if this was an English class, think about that phenomenon is like a passage, and then there's multiple parts or ways that students are being asked to interact or respond to that passage. That's what a cluster would be in science. I have a similar scenario, and then I'm being asked to engage in it with it in multiple ways. Standalone items will still include a phenomenon or an engineering design problem, but they'll usually only perform a single task or interaction. A couple times there may be like multiple parts, but they're like directly related to each other as opposed to thinking about it in multiple ways. So that's what is meant by like those clusters versus a standalone. Standalone items, so we know that our science standards are three-dimensional. So we have our disciplinary core ideas, our science and engineering practices, and then those cross-cutting concepts. A standalone item will assess two of those three dimensions, whereas a cluster item will assess all three of those. So it will have cross-cutting concepts in it, as well as the engineering, science and engineering practices and the DCIs that it's addressing. This is just an example. I'm not going to spend a ton of time of just the different types of interactions that students will see on the science test. One thing to be mindful of with a science test is it's important to get students like in the platform and actually playing with the tools, especially for these like simulation items, because it's not something that can be recreated like in a paper and pencil version, right? Because they're putting in variables and it's generating it for them. So just having students kind of get familiar with the platform and with these different types of interactions can reduce some of one, test anxiety, because it's not, the stress of just, well, I know what it's asking, but I don't actually know how to show what I know. But can also help with those that are maybe, less familiar with this type of technology. It can reduce that as a barrier to accessing the content. So this is an example from middle school, the blueprint. You'll see that we have those three domains. The reason it doesn't have the science and engineering practices is, again, those are embedded within these content items. So we'll report out on them, but there aren't items necessarily specifically for those. So a student would see two clusters for each of those three domains, and then 4 standalone items for each of those three domains for a total of 18 questions, or 18 types of items. I believe high school has an additional cluster in each of those domains. I haven't looked at the high school blueprint in a while, but it's still fairly similar to this. Questions so far on kind of just the structure of the ISAT? I know this is just a quick snapshot of the blueprint. There will be time for you guys to dive into that later if you want, but I will pause if there are any questions or clarifications so far. And if anytime you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, that way I can see them and can respond to them as needed. So I want to just give you an idea of, okay, we know the structure, we kind of talked about what the iSAT is measuring, but what does that look like in practice? So this is a sample, this is a sample item from a practice test. This is a cluster item. So you'll see that stimuli on the left-hand side and then the different parts. As you look through this, I don't want you to necessarily solve it, but I want you to think through, what do you notice about the problem? What is the actual question for just part A, since that's what we're looking at here? And what information would you need to answer the question? So kind of put yourself in the role of a student or somebody who's interacting with this item and think through those questions. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and now move to a different part. So it's still based on that same stimuli of the cell phone and creating a cell phone case. And same three kind of thinking questions. What do you notice about this question, part E? What is it asking? And what information would you need to answer the question? So when I worked with teachers as an instructional coach, and then also just in my own experience teaching, I noticed that a lot of times, especially for like really heavily worded or complex tasks, students would get that like overwhelmed feeling, or they didn't necessarily know where to start, right? And that was the initial barrier. Usually, once we could get past, hey, here's a place you could start, then they had access and could at least try. So these ask yourself questions are really designed to be kind of that internal, like metacognitive routine that a student can use when they're problem solving. So while we're using a sample ISAT problem for that, this is something that could apply to their other coursework. Um, and you'll notice that they're really intended to be open-ended, broad questions. Like, let's just start with, what do I notice? I asked that of teachers, and a lot of them are like, what? This is what you're looking for. And I'm like, it's not a trick question. It really is as broad as, like, just tell me what you see. What stood out to you? So just know you may have students who do that too, and they're like, is this the right answer? And you're like, there's no right answer, just what are you noticing? But also focusing on what is the task in front of me? What is the question actually asking for? Because in real life, it's not laid out for us, right? We have to kind of assess the situation. And then from whatever is presented, we go back and figure out, well, what data do we need or information do we need to really tackle that? The other reason, kind of focusing on the actual question, is for your students who are maybe really fast processors. And this, again, with my math background, so those kids who always raise their answer or raise their hand and were like, I have the answer. And they'd give me a number. And I was like, great, but that's not the question. I didn't ask you for a number. So it gives them kind of that pause too. So it's a support for your students who maybe struggle with where to start, but it can also be a support for your students who are fast processors and maybe jumping ahead to just take a minute and think, does the answer my brain told me make sense in relation to what's actually being asked? So just to give you a little bit of background around this specific test, this practice test item, and this came from the practice test answer keys, which I will give you the link to towards the end of the presentation. But this item is aligned to the high school physical science standard 2-3, where we're applying scientific and engineering ideas. It has the SEP of constructing explanations and designing solutions. It's dealing with that big idea of forces in motion and the cross-cutting concept of cause and effect. As far as scoring goes, obviously responses will vary depending on what students see, but it does outline here what they would receive a point for. So kind of those specifics of what they would hope to look at the students table and see. Before we move on, is anyone feeling brave and want to share something that they noticed about as they were kind of thinking through that item, wonderings they had, insights as we went through that process? You can either come off mute or put it in the chat, whatever feels
I'm
comfortable.
hoping some science people might speak up because some English people here in this room might be feeling a little challenged right now, like me.
Yeah, so I guess the main thing that I took away was just being able to have the kids interact with something like this because it's different than what we've been able to do, I guess,
Yeah.
like with the practice test. So I like that there is that option just for them to kind of create more of their own. I don't know. So I've been wondering how to do that, I guess, in a way. Um, yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I know I love that there are simulation items, right? As much as we can recreate kind of that lab experience or this idea of running trials. Um, but it definitely is different than even a lot of curricular resources, whether it's virtual or, a brick and mortar classroom will provide for students. So definitely getting them in the platform.
I have a question about it. When they
Yeah.
fill in the different parameters there, does the chart there automatically fill in, or do they actually have to know, do they have to bring the formula with them, the F equals times A, to be able to calculate that force? Or,
That's a great question. It will automatically fill it in for
okay,
them. So they're just changing those variables, and then it will populate it.
okay.
And you'll notice in the question, it says like you can only have up to 4 prototypes. They can run more simulations and then just delete things, and they'll only be scored on whatever is remaining, which is why it also specifies like you must have at least 3. But that's a great question. Yeah. So in these simulations, they do not have to calculate it. It will automatically populate. Awesome. Yeah, and Jenny, hopefully I said your name correctly, just had that wondering of like, I wonder if I would see a pattern and, kind of thinking through those different items. Hey, so think about the item that we just explored. And I want you to think about like your students, either current year, kind of over the course of your career. But what would you need to see from students to feel confident that they truly understood the concept that's being measured or the concepts being measured, and not just that they got the right answer? So take a moment to kind of reflect like, what would it mean for a student to be proficient? What would you need to see from them? And then again, if anyone is feeling like a risk taker or feeling brave and wants to put their ideas in the chat or come off of mute.
I will.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think if the student can apply what they've learned, or if they can generalize that concept across different settings, um, then that would tell me that they understand it and have mastery of it.
That idea of application and transfer.
Yes. Like I don't want them to know that they can just do it in an isolated setting, like in a controlled setting, like like in a test setting where it's just one way. I want to know that if they see it in a different setting or in a different way or in a different application, that they can use it. Otherwise, what's the point of teaching them, right? If they can just do it in an isolated setting and then not be able to transfer that and use it like it's supposed to be used.
No, that is perfectly stated. And it's kind of like you read my mind, because that is what the next slide talks about, right? Like, what does it mean to really be proficient and in any content area? But I think especially we see more of a struggle in this in like the STEM fields. But it's not just what are the, skills or the procedures that you have memorized. It's what can you do with what you know? Can you apply those skills and procedures to new situations? Can you transfer it to a problem that you haven't seen before or that doesn't look like what you're used to seeing? And then a lot of you also mentioned just that idea of reasoning. Can you explain why you chose that tool or why that would apply to this situation? Because if we have a bunch of tools but don't know when to use them, where to use them, when one might work better than the other, then it's just a bunch of isolated knowledge that kind of sits there. Full disclosure, I did not love my science classes. I even didn't love math class, which is funny because now math education is kind of my background. But it was a bunch of like rules and procedures and memorization. And I did well. I was in honors classes. I performed fine, but none of it made sense. And then as soon as things started connecting and I saw like patterns and those like cross-cutting ideas of like, oh, this is the structure of science, this is the structure of math, and both of them are about reasoning and problem solving and application. I really was like, where has this been my whole life? This is fascinating. And so if we can create those experiences for our students before they get to college, hopefully, um, I think that just opens up so many more doors for them. And they can also see how it applies to their life outside of that specific content. So I appreciate that you all have that understanding as well as like that application, that transfer, that deeper level of thinking. And that's the main reason that we have those 3 dimensions in science, right? It's not just about these memorized skills or facts, but how does everything work together? What does that process look like? Okay. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into items now, and give you a chance to explore what item developers actually take into consideration as they're creating items. And then just to give you some insight into the item development process. So content experts and assessment experts create items, but then all of those items go through multiple rounds of reviews for looking for like fairness issues, like are there certain student demographics that perform more poorly on this based on whatever the background might be. Idaho educators look through it to make sure it's actually measuring what it says it is, like the standard is aligned to our Idaho standards. So while they may be developed by like content and assessment experts, educators are a part of that item development process. And then every item is field tested to see if it's performing as expected before it becomes like an operational item that students would be scored on. So the science item specifications, which is a mouthful, but basically what that means is it's what item developers look at and have to follow when they're creating an item. So it adds connections and alignment to the DCIs, the cross-cutting concepts, and the SEP for each of those standards. It will talk about like a further explanation, so kind of diving into what is meant by that standard, but also content limits. So if we're looking at something about like how waves operate, it will say students need to know this, but they may not be tested on this. So it will kind of give you where that top limit would be. It also outlines vocabulary that may and also may not be used in an assessment item, as well as example phenomena and task demands. So some ways that you could use this to deepen your own knowledge is to help you understand like what students are expected to know and be able to do for each of the standards. Looking at the vocabulary and academic language that you can use to support student understanding. We know a lot of, especially in content areas that have a lot of rich academic language like science, that often is a barrier for kids. Like maybe they have the concept, but they don't have the words to explain. So as we're thinking about providing additional support, sometimes those interventions or supplemental instruction can be around not just like, here's a vocabulary word and I want you to memorize the definition, but what is this concept? And let's talk about it using the academic language. And then also just deepening your own understanding of how those 3 dimensions come together within different items or within different standards. So, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint. Probably next week, I will have it sent to you, Clayton, and then you can share out this one and the ELA one. I believe I'm recording. Hopefully I remembered. Yep. Good. It is still recording. And you guys will get those as well, but that will take a little bit longer. So I will show you how to navigate to the specifications. All right. Can you guys now see the Idaho portal webpage? Is that what's showing? Perfect. So to get to the Idaho portal, I usually just go to Google or whatever your search engine is and type in Idaho portal, and it's almost always the first thing that pops up. I have a bookmark, but whatever works best for you. From the home page, you'll go into resources, and just in the search bar, if you type in item specifications, you'll see the ISAT Science specifications playlist, which will break it down with elementary, and then there's middle school and high school. So again, from the homepage of the Idaho portal, go to resources, search item specifications, and then the science specifications playlist. So go ahead and choose whichever one applies to the grade level or courses that you support. I want you to just kind of scan through them for a standard that you teach or support in your courses, and then just read through the information that is there. Again, think about what do you notice, what maybe validates what you already understand about that standard, and was there anything surprising? So I'll give you around 5 minutes or so to look through independently. And then even though we're a small group, I think we'll break into 2 like breakout rooms. You guys can have some small group conversations as well. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. I just did randomly assign since we are mostly kind of the same content areas. So feel free to share in your small group some of the things that you noticed or that stuck out to you as you were reviewing the resources. Jimin, would you like me to put you in one of the breakout rooms?
I'm sorry, I was trying to unmute. I can, yeah, if you want, I can sit there and listen to what they're
Doesn't matter to
discussing.
me.
That'll
It's
be
up to
important.
you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me see what they're learn.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. I think I signed you to one. Hopefully it popped up for you. If you don't see it, you can click more on the bottom of the screen. There you go. Okay. Welcome back. Hopefully you had some good discussions. I know that wasn't a ton of time, but hopefully it gave you a little bit of a taste. If I could have one person from each group just share something that you discussed.
Um, we were we dove into the high school science standards, and a couple of things we just noticed how much it was, how overwhelming it can be for a student to open up a test item that they've never seen before, that is cross-cutting so many different standards at once, seeing charts they've never seen, reading words they've never seen, um, which is, like you said, is the point, to use the science skills to work their way through it. But I think a lot of students open those up and think, well, I wasn't taught this. I've never seen this, and maybe start guessing instead of diving in and using those skills. So we talked about kind of developing that language for students in all courses of you're expected to use the skills you're being taught, not so much the actual content, and how we could help, other classes could help with that, and then we could help with other classes too. We could use our math standards in ours, and our ELA standards too. So kind of that idea of what is it actually assessing, and how do we
Mhm.
teach to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that idea of thinking across content area and across courses as well. That's great. The other group.
Oh, is there only two groups? I'll go.
Mm.
So we kind of had the same idea, Adam. We were talking about, just the fact of preparing the students for the logistics of the test. Even if they knew the answer, and I think we see this even in our courses, even if the student knows the answer, if they're not prepared for how the question is asked, um, they don't do well. You know what I mean? And we see this every day in our courses. And so if they're not prepared on the format of the test or the specific vocabulary that they may see, they're not going to do well. And I think that that is reflected when students go in and they look at it and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to do this. I can't do this. And even if they know the information, they're like, I'm overwhelmed. I'm just going to click through. And we see it. I mean, any of us who have proctored the test, we see it over and over and over with the kids, like go through in like 20 minutes or 15 minutes. It's not really a true measure of what I think they actually know. So preparing students and being purposeful about preparing students to go in and do their best and make sure that they're prepared for the format and the vocabulary and how the test is set up, and let them know that it's okay. You can take a little time and encouraging them. I think just setting them up for success, I think, is a really big thing that we need to be doing moving forward. So,
Yeah, I love that. Um, when I was an instructional coach, sometimes I would go in and like do a brief model lesson for teachers of how to use some of the like sample items. And often, especially because it was math, right? But I'd just start with, how are you feeling? Like, don't even try and address the question right now. It was like, and some kids were like, I'm excited. There was also a lot of like overwhelmed. And so just acknowledging that and saying, yeah, what can you do to move through those emotions so that you can access what you know? And sometimes I could just see like a breath of relief from the students when they heard other kids say they were overwhelmed. Because it's like, oh, I'm not alone. Okay. And not, that's going to be a game changer, but I think just helping them recognize like, that's really normal. This is a lot. That's a lot of words. It's a lot of text on the page. What skills do you have? And then they would usually brainstorm and be like, oh, I could take some deep breaths, or I could chunk the text. Oh, if I know what the question is asking, that gives me something to look for as I'm like diving into the rest of it. So I love that idea of just helping kids kind of look through that, which really for any coursework are good skills that transfer. We're just using maybe a sample test item to help remind them of that as well. Any other takeaways that someone wants to share before we move on?
Want to share something? I
Yeah.
did notice a question around practice tests. So they want kids to be able to see how the test looks like, how the context reads, etc. How so that they can get comfortable with the interface and then the questions and all that. And so we do have resources for that. And so I just wanted to let you all know that there is a practice test on our portal, so that you can access at any time, and so the kids can see how, like, sample questions, what it's going to look like for science, etc. So, but I let Amber take it away. Just notice that.
That's a beautiful transition, Jeanette. Thank you. So that's kind of what this next section is. Now we've kind of covered like, what is the test measuring? What goes into the content on the test and how students are interacting with it. We're going to talk a little bit about the resources that are available to help you, but also students become more familiar with the actual platform, with those items, and understanding things. So there are 3 different types of assessments that come we call like our ISAT suite or package. So there are practice tests, interim assessments, and the summative. So up to this point, we've really talked mainly about the summative. Those item specifications also go into like the item development for the interim assessments and the practice tests. Practice tests are publicly available, so you can share them with students and families, and they are all publicly released items, so there's no like issues or worries about like exposure of those items. I don't know why my screen likes to advance itself sometimes. One of those technology things where you're like, I love you until you don't do what I want you to. So when we say security level is low for practice tests, that's because they are publicly available items. We say the audience of practice tests are students, parents, educators. It could be community members. Because again, the main purpose of the practice tests is platform familiarity. So it will address content as well, but they are not going to be scored automatically. And they're designed with the intention of, let's give a variety of the different interactions that students will or could encounter on the summative ISAT. So those simulation type items, that's the main focus, is really what are the different types of interaction, multiple select, multiple choice, simulations, getting kids familiar with the practice or with the platform. Interim assessments, their main focus is actually gathering data around a specific either DCI, science and engineering practice, or a specific domain. And because we're gathering data, There will still be a variety of item types, but you won't see every item type that a student may encounter, right? Every interaction, because we're only pulling items that are related to a specific DCI or concept. We say they are medium security, meaning teachers can see the items, educators can see the items, obviously students can, but they are not publicly available. So they can't be posted to, say, like the word left my head, but um, like a learning management system or Google Classroom, any of those things, they couldn't be posted publicly there. And we would ask that you would at least be supervising how students are interacting with those. So probably for your context, the practice tests are going to be the most flexible, just since you have students kind of working at their own pace and doing things at different times. But if you want actual like data in your system, then you would use the interim assessments for that and assign them and proctor it the same way you would the summative assessment. We want to talk about summative assessments because I think you guys are already fairly familiar with that, hopefully by this point. So I'm not going to bore you by reading all of these. Again, this slide has a lot of information, but mainly so that when you get it, you have it as a quick reference. But like I said, the practice tests are designed for platform familiarity. Students can either log in with their specific login. So if they have any like accessibility features, accommodations that have been uploaded into the system, if they log in as themselves, all of that will be populated for them. So they could practice like if they have text to speech, but they can also log in as a guest, which one is nice because you don't have to be there. They don't have to have their information. But if they log in as a guest, a lot of those accessibility features and supports, they can actually turn on to see what it might look like. So an example would be like masking, where part of the screen gets covered up, or like color contrast, where it's not, you think about like dark mode on your phone, it has the option to like change the contrast. So it will be in like that dark mode for kids. So students in other schools have told me that having kids kind of play around with those has helped them see what supports a student might actually benefit from that they wouldn't have known about before. So that's one of the benefits of logging in as a guest. The interim assessments, there are 3 different types for science. We have testlets, which are organized by a specific DCI or a specific SEP. We have standalone because they're only made up of standalone items, but they are around in the secondary school or in the secondary grades, they're around a specific science domain. So like only items related to life science or only items related to physical sciences. There's also the comprehensive assessment, which is designed to mirror like the summative. It is shorter than the end of year ISAT, but it will cover all like the 3-dimensional standards across the entire grade band. And it is computer adaptive. So you can't necessarily get like item level information that you could from the others, but it will adapt based on how students respond to the question. Because there's quite a few interims, this is just kind of a decision-making guide or a reference of like, hey, if I want to gather data around a specific DCI, I'm going to then use a testlet. And that can be really helpful if you're like, hey, students are currently in this course. I want to provide them, an opportunity to practice, or I want to gather data on how they're doing related to that concept. Again, there's testlets specifically for the science and engineering practices. So you can see how are they applying those across different content areas. And then again, if you just want to look at all of life science, you could give one of the standalones or the comprehensive if you wanted more that broader view. The interim blueprints, and when I give you a chance to explore, I will drop a reference sheet that has like direct links and the navigation of where to find all of these. So if you're like, this is so much and I don't know where I'd ever find it, I promise it's coming. But the interim blueprints list all of the available testlets and standalones. So you can see like what is the name maybe based on the DCI I want to look at. There are answer keys for the interim assessments, and oh, it's not on here, but there are also answer keys for the practice tests. Because of the like ways that students interact with the science assessment, there's not an easy way to like print items, which in your setting wouldn't make sense really anyway, since it's virtual. But because it has like those simulations and things, you can't really create those in a screenshot or a printed version, which is why whether it's a practice test or an interim, there's not an easy way to like create a PDF of those items. So hopefully that might be something we can do in the future for the items that, you know, aren't that live simulation, but just know that is one of the restraints we have right now. Hey. Again, just like we want to make sure with assessments that we're using the right tool for the right purpose, the right question is going to drive the resource that you choose. So if you as a teacher want to dive more into what the ISAT is actually testing at your grade level, that's where those science blueprints and the item specifications can kind of come in. Going to that question of like, what will the testing experience look like for students? That's where the practice tests and interim assessments are the best resource. Looking at kind of that alignment of the item on a practice test or an interim test and how it would be scored. You can look at the interim reports or the answer keys to get more information about that. And then I include this last question, again, not knowing kind of the structure fully of your school, but I know across the state, some science courses are more integrated approach and some are more like they take life science in 6th grade and earth science in 7th grade or whatever it might be. But because it's a grade band, if they're taking physical science, say in 8th grade, it may have been 2 years since they've interacted with some of the other content they'll be tested on. So using some of those interims or even practice test items as like warm-ups or a way for them to just re-engage with material they've already done in previous courses or previous years can be helpful to set them up for success when they take the test kind of at the end of that grade band. All right. So in the chat, I'm going to drop the handout for science, and it will include links or the navigation of the different resources we've talked about today. I want you, again, we're going to start independently and then move kind of to a breakout discussion, but choose one resource from today that you want to dive into, explore a little bit more. It says 7 minutes. I'll probably just kind of see how the timing goes and how you all are feeling. But again, just those general questions. What are things that you notice? What is one way that you could use this resource to support your students and maybe further that conversation of across content areas? I'm also going to drop the handout from the ELA and math. So for those of you who support those content areas, or if you want to see what's available for ELA and math, even if you don't teach it. Um, that is there for you as well. Any questions or clarifications you have before I send you to explore? All right, then go ahead and dive in. Again, we'll start independently and then I will set up and send you to breakout rooms for small group discussion. All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had some good discussions. If I could get someone to share out from each group, that would be great.
I guess I can share for our group. Being a health and PE teacher, it's been challenging. But I think we know that we need to just start implementing some things into our classes. And so using things like we already have, like bell ringers and ways that students can start seeing these these questions and the format and the words and all of that. And if anyone else wants to jump in from my group, feel free. But yeah, we just kind of feel like we're playing the game at this point, and for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Our group kind of said the same thing as the bell ringers. Ginny did bring up that the math department has implemented some different things, and so maybe to go into some of their courses and look and see what they've done as far as breaking them down so they're not so big. Another thing that we talked about in our group is buy-in. How do we get the buy-in? We talked a little bit about how when it was a graduation requirement, there was more buy-in, but it's really hard to get the buy-in from students and parents, especially in our online environment. We talked about in a brick and mortar, it's a lot easier to do the interim assessments, but the manpower it takes to do those in our school is a lot, and we didn't get the attendance that we needed to keep supporting that. So those are some struggles as far as the online school format that we have. But again, I think doing we thought bell ringers, maybe offering some extra credit for students that attempt some of those are all good ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing the real challenges. That really is like the purpose of showing, hey, here's what's available. You all know your context and your students and what's going to best fit within your structure. Which is also why I included the practice tests, because since those can be done slightly more independently, hopefully those might give you a few more ways to kind of integrate it in a way that like you said, is more doable with, you know, the asynchronous nature of the way your students interact with their courses.
How often do you guys kind of refresh that practice material?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the practice tests are, I don't know the set timeline. Um, I do think they get refreshed a little bit more just as like different item interactions come available or, you know, more items get released, then they'll become practice test items. Um, the interims are not necessarily like overhauled, but will like have some minor changes, like maybe an item is swapped out if the data is coming back that it's performing as expected. Um, or I know one that was like, oh, this actually had some content alignment issues, so it got pulled and they're developing a new one that will better fit the content it's
Okay.
designed to measure. So it is kind of an ongoing iterative process, but it's not like everything gets overhauled all the time.
So is there, like, if what Catherine was saying is that those interim tests really are difficult for us to implement. It's almost the same effort as just doing the ISATs.
Yep.
But the practice tests, like you said, are so accessible. Can we feel confident that those practice tests, it would expose students to all the tools and kind of different charts and things that they would need to be comfortable with?
Yeah, because that's the main purpose of them is the platform familiarity. So it
Okay.
will expose them more so to like, here's all the different interactions. Um, like they can see like the periodic table and the calculator like in the top, just like they would in the actual testing platform.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can feel very confident that the practice tests will have everything that they would see on like the summative assessment as far as platform interactions.
So I feel like, talking to our staff here, that is something that maybe we should highlight for students, is to not just say this is the content that we want you to understand prior to the test, but like these are the tools that we want you to have familiarity with. So you click through this at your own peril, right? So just a thought there.
Awesome. Any other takeaways or things that came up in your conversations?
I guess I can add one more thing is that I think Adam made a great point is that when our students come in to take this test, like we need to do some sort of, it's tough because we have students coming and going sometimes at different times, but some sort of introduction instead of saying, hey, here's how you log in, giving them some sort of background as to why we want them to do well on this test. Um, and then I know Catherine even brought up, like, yeah, it can be challenging when you have parents just saying, like, come in, go do it, get out as fast as you can. Who cares? It doesn't really matter. And that's where I think that buy-in piece we were talking about, it's challenging right now.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those, because I used to be like, oh, standardized assessments, right? And then like when I learned about the purpose of them, No Child Left Behind did us a very bad disservice of making them, you know, a lot more high stakes than they were before. Um, but as far as like the state goes, there's not, the purpose of it is, can we gather data to really evaluate systems and make sure that we are providing supports for students that will best serve them. So I think even just giving students and parents insight into that's the purpose. Like, yes, we're getting data on like this point in time, how is your student doing in relation to the standards? But the bigger purpose of it is to ensure that our curriculum is meeting their needs, right? And that the things that we've put in place as a school are having the intended purpose and bringing in, multiple measures. And I think sometimes just giving them insight into what that framing is, it's not going to change everybody's mind, but it can maybe help open up that discussion a little bit to be like, it's not just a pointless test, but I'm also not using it to evaluate necessarily you individually. It helps us better serve the school and all the students. So sometimes giving them that broader picture might help at least a little bit of opening their mind.
Gail Jones brought up a great comment about that it's preparing them for tests that they are going to take, the ISATs, the SATs, college tests, trade tests, that this is a great way to learn how to take a test. And so I think at iSucceed, we could really use that in our career development and some of our courses, that the ISATs are a good way to practice for that.
Yeah, that's a great point too.
So if you guys didn't give Melissa Price that feedback about some sort of script or spiel in the live testing or in the in-person testing, please do, because you're right. That's a super good point. We do that for the remote testing. There is a little bit. We could probably do more, but it's not in the in-person testing, and we should.
Yeah, great point. Okay. Just as we kind of come to a close, again, I appreciate all of the time and the deep dive you've done into it. Those of you who are not science teachers who came to learn more about it and at least think creatively about how you can support different content areas. If you would, in the chat, this just gives me some feedback too. Put in like one resource or one takeaway that you want to reflect on before kind of the end of this school year. I would appreciate that. And then the rest of the time is just for questions. So I will be here until the last person is gone. So add your takeaway or resource in the chat. And then if you have anything else, let me know. Awesome. Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time, like I said, especially at the end of the school year. So I hope you all have a great rest of the year and a great summer.